The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of gold and crimson as Captain Sarah Mitchell performed her pre-flight inspection of the A-10 Thunderbolt II. The aircraft, affectionately known as the Warthog, sat heavily on the tarmac at Davis Mountain Air Force Base, its twin, engines gleaming under the early light. Sarah ran her hand along the titanium armor plating that protected the cockpit, a ritual she had performed hundreds of times before, but today felt different somehow. At 28, Sarah was one of the youngest pilots in her squadron, but her skills in the cockpit had earned her the respect of even the most seasoned aviators. She had joined the Air Force, straight out of college, driven by a childhood dream sparked by watching fighter jets streak across the sky at air shows. Her father, a Vietnam War veteran, had initially worried about his daughter's choice, but her determination and natural flying ability had eventually won his proud support. The A-10 she was preparing to fly that day bore the tail number 80BO248, a aircraft with its own distinguished history. Built in 1980, it had served in Operation Desert Storm, survived multiple deployments to Afghanistan, and had been lovingly maintained by generations of crew chiefs. The aircraft's battle scars told stories of close air support missions where it had protected ground troops, its powerful Ju-8 cannon and missile systems proving invaluable in countless operations. As Sarah completed her walkhound inspection, she noticed her crew chief, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, approaching with a slight frown creasing his weathered face. Rodriguez had been working on A-10s for over 15 years and knew every bolt and rivet of the aircraft under his care. His intuition about mechanical issues was legendary in the squadron, and pilots had learned to trust his judgment implicitly. "Captain, I've been over the maintenance logs 3 times, Rodriguez said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Everything checks out perfect on paper, but something's been nagging at me about the hydraulic system readings from yesterday's flight. The numbers are within spec, but they are at the high end of normal." Sarah paused in her inspection, knowing that Rodriguez's concerns were never trivial. The A-10's hydraulic systems were crucial for flight control, landing gear operation, and weapon systems. Any failure could turn a routine training mission into a life-threatening emergency. She had complete faith in the aircraft's redundant systems and her own ability to handle emergencies, but she also respected the experienced sergeant's instincts. That today's mission was a joint training exercise with F-16 Fighting Falcons from Luke Air Force Base. The exercise, called Desert Thunder, was designed to simulate close air support scenarios where A-10s would work in coordination with faster fighter aircraft to support ground operations. Sarah would be flying as part of a 4-ship formation with her wingman, Lieutenant Torres, and another A-10, while a pair of F-16s would provide top cover and coordination. The briefing room had been filled with the usual pre-mission energy as pilots reviewed weather conditions, target areas, and emergency procedures. The exercise would take place over the Bariam-Goldwater Range, a vast expanse of desert that had been used for military training for decades. The terrain was unforgiving with jagged mountains, deep canyons, and miles of scrub brush that could easily hide a downed aircraft. Major Harrison, the mission commander, had emphasized the importance of maintaining proper separation between aircraft and following all safety protocols. "Remember, this is training, but we treat it like the real thing," he had said, his experienced eyes scanning the room. "The desert doesn't care if this is just practice, and neither should any of you." As Sarah strapped herself into the cockpit of 80,248, she felt the familiar comfort of being surrounded by the A-10's robust construction. The aircraft had been designed from the ground up to keep pilots alive with redundant flight controls, self-sealing fuel tanks, and armor plating that could withstand significant battle damage. The cockpit itself was encased in a titanium bathtub that could stop armor-piercing rounds up to 23 millimeters. The engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and Sarah began working through her pre-takeoff checklist with methodical precision. Every switch position, every gauge reading, every system status was verified and cross-checked. The A-10 might not be the fastest or most glamorous aircraft in the Air Force inventory, but it was reliable, tough, and deadly effective at its mission of close air support. Radio chatter crackled in her headset as the other aircraft in the formation completed their startup procedures. Lieutenant Torres reported, ready in the second A-10, while the F-16 pilots from Luke were already airborne and circling overhead waiting for the Warthogs to join them. The contrast between the two aircraft types was stark. The sleek supersonic F-16s represented the cutting edge of fighter technology, while the angular subsonic A-10s were purpose-built flying tanks designed to operate in the thick of ground combat. As Sarah taxied toward the active runway, she couldn't shake a subtle feeling of unease that had been building since her conversation with Sergeant Rodriguez. She had learned to trust her instincts during her years of flying, and something about this mission felt different. The aircraft was responding normally to all her inputs. The engine parameters were stable and all systems showed green, but an experienced pilot develops a sixth sense about their aircraft that goes beyond instrument readings. The tower cleared her for takeoff, and Sarah advanced the throttles, feeling the twin General Electric TF-34 engines pushed the heavily loaded 10 down the runway. The aircraft accelerated with the steady, predictable power curve she knew so well, and soon the desert floor was falling away beneath her landing gear. As she climbed toward the designated training altitude, Sarah pushed aside her concerns and focused on the mission ahead, unaware that the next few hours would test every skill she had developed and every lesson she had learned about survival in the unforgiving environment of military aviation. The formation climbed steadily through the crystal-clear Arizona sky, with Sarah maintaining perfect position off Lieutenant Torres's left wing. Below them, the Sonoran Desert stretched endlessly, a patchwork of brown and tan broken only by the occasional mountain range jutting up like ancient monuments. The two F-16s had taken their positions higher and ahead, their silver forms barely visible as they prepared to simulate the air-to-air protection role that would be critical in actual combat operations. Captain Jake Morrison flew the lead F-16, his aircraft bearing the distinctive Luke Air Force Base markings of the 56th Fighter Wing. Morrison was a seasoned pilot with over 2,000 hours in the F-16, having flown combat missions over Iraq and Afghanistan. His wingman, First Lieutenant Kim Chun, was newer to the F-16 community, but had quickly established herself as one of the most promising young pilots in the squadron. Both pilots understood the vital importance of the close air support mission and had developed deep respect for the A-10 pilots who flew into harm's way to protect ground troops. The training scenario began with a simulated call for close air support from ground controllers positioned at the Barry M. Goldwater Range. Sarah's radio crackled with the familiar cadence of a joint terminal attack, controller requesting immediate assistance for troops in contact. The exercise was designed to replicate the chaos and urgency of real combat, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between saving friendly forces and causing tragic casualties. Hog 11, this is Gunslinger 77, came the voice of the ground controller. We have troops in contact grid 32 SMB 567834. Request immediate close air support. Danger close. Friendlies marked with orange panels. Sarah acknowledged the call and began her approach to the target area, her eyes scanning the terrain below for the designated markers. The A-10 systems were perfectly suited for this type of precision attack, with its sophisticated targeting pods and the pilot's ability to visually identify targets from relatively low altitudes. Unlike fast-moving fighters that might flash over a target area in seconds, the A-10 could loiter and provide sustained fire support when ground troops needed it most. As she rolled into her attack run, Sarah felt a subtle vibration through the aircraft's controls that hadn't been there during takeoff. It was barely perceptible, more of a feeling than something she could clearly identify. but her experienced hands detected the slight change in the way the stick responded to her inputs. She made a mental note to mention it to Sergeant Rodriguez after the flight, but the vibration wasn't severe enough to abort the training mission. The attack run proceeded smoothly with Sarah, delivering simulated ordnance on target while maintaining safe separation from the imaginary friendly forces. The ground controllers confirmed successful hits and cleared her for additional passes. Lieutenant Torres followed with his own attack run, and the two A-10s worked in perfect coordination, demonstrating the type of sustained firepower that made the Warthog so valuable to ground commanders. Above them, the F-16s maintained their protective orbit, their pilots monitoring the radio frequencies and scanning the sky for any simulated threats that might interrupt the close air support mission. The exercise was progressing exactly as planned, with all aircraft performing their roles flawlessly in the complex choreography of modern air-ground operations. It was during her third attack pass that Sarah first noticed something was definitely wrong with her aircraft. The vibration had intensified, and now she could feel it through her seat as well as the flight controls. More concerning, the hydraulic pressure gauge for the primary flight control system was showing a slow but steady decline from its normal operating range. The needle was still within acceptable limits, but the downward trend was unmistakable. Sarah immediately began running through emergency procedures in her mind while continuing to fly the aircraft normally. The A-10 had been designed with multiple redundant systems specifically to handle this type of failure. If the primary hydraulic system failed completely, the backup system would take over automatically, and if that failed too, the aircraft had a manual reversion capability that would allow her to maintain control using pure muscle power and trim tabs. Hog 111. Hog 12, Lieutenant Torres called over the radio. I'm seeing some kind of fluid streaming from your aircraft. Looks like it's coming from the belly area, possibly hydraulic fluid. Sarah's heart rate increased as she processed this information. External hydraulic leaks were serious business, potentially indicating catastrophic system failure. She immediately began climbing away from the target area while running through her emergency checklist. The primary hydraulic pressure was now showing a more rapid decline, and warning lights were beginning to illuminate on her instrument panel. Gunslinger 77 Hog 11 declaring an emergency. Sarah transmitted her voice, calm and professional despite the seriousness of the situation. I have a primary hydraulic system failure, and I'm terminating the exercise. Request vectors to nearest suitable airfield and emergency services standing by. The training exercise immediately transformed into a real-world emergency response operation. Captain Morrison in the lead F-16 moved his aircraft into a position where he could better observe Sarah's A-10 while ground controllers began coordinating with air traffic control and emergency services. The professional demeanor of all involved reflected years of training for exactly this type of situation. From his vantage point, above and behind the stricken A-10, Morrison could clearly see the hydraulic fluid streaming from the aircraft's belly. The fluid was creating a visible trail in the air, and the volume of the leak suggested a major system rupture rather than a minor seal failure. He relayed his observations to Sarah and the ground controllers, providing crucial information that would help determine the best course of action. Sarah's aircraft was still controllable, but she could feel the flight controls becoming increasingly heavy as the hydraulic assistance diminished. The A-10's manual reversion system was robust, but flying the aircraft without hydraulic assistance was physically demanding and would become more challenging as fuel consumption reduced the aircraft's weight distribution. More critically, she would need hydraulic pressure for normal landing gear extension and wheel brakes. The nearest suitable airfield was Davis-Monthan, her home base, but that was still 40 minutes away under normal circumstances. With her degraded flight controls and the possibility of complete hydraulic failure, Sarah needed to consider her options carefully. The Barry M. Goldwater Range had an emergency landing strip, but it was uncontrolled and lacked the crash and rescue facilities that might be needed if the landing went badly. As she wrestled with the increasingly heavy flight controls, Sarah began to notice smoke beginning to seep into the cockpit. The acrid smell was unmistakable and immediately triggered additional alarms in her mind. Smoke in the cockpit of any aircraft was a serious emergency, but an A-10 that was already dealing with hydraulic failure, it suggested the possibility of fire in the aircraft systems. Fire was every pilot's worst nightmare, capable of destroying an aircraft in minutes and leaving no time for careful decision-making. The combination of hydraulic failure and smoke in the cockpit meant that Sarah's emergency had just escalated to a life-threatening situation that would test every aspect of her training and experience. The smoke in the cockpit was getting thicker, and Sarah could feel her eyes beginning to water despite the oxygen flowing through her mask. She immediately began the emergency procedures for smoke and fire, shutting down non-essential electrical systems and adjusting the environmental control system to prevent additional smoke from entering the cockpit. The acrid smell was getting stronger, suggesting that whatever was burning was producing toxic fumes that could quickly incapacitate her. She couldn't get the situation under control. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency across the instrument panel, following procedures that had been drilled into her memory through countless hours of training. Every emergency scenario she had practiced in the simulator was designed for exactly this moment when training would have to overcome the natural human tendency toward panic in life-threatening situations. Sarah's instructors had always emphasized that emergencies were best handled by pilots who could think clearly and work through problems systematically rather than those who relied purely on reflexes. Hog 111. I now have smoke in the cockpit. In addition to the hydraulic failure, Sarah transmitted, her voice still calm, but with an undertone of urgency that hadn't been there before, requesting immediate clearance to the nearest airfield and all available emergency equipment. Captain Morrison in the F-16 had moved his aircraft to within a few hundred yards of Sarah's A-10, close enough to observe details of the aircraft's condition, but far enough away to avoid any debris if the situation deteriorated further. From his position, he could see that the hydraulic leak had worsened, and there now appeared to be a thin stream of smoke trailing from the area around the left engine. The sight sent a chill down his spine as he realized his fellow pilot was dealing with multiple life-threatening emergencies simultaneously. Hog 111, Viper 111 has you in sight, Morrison called. I can see smoke coming from your left engine area, and the hydraulic leak appears to be getting worse. Recommend you consider ejection if the situation continues to deteriorate. The mention of ejection focused Sarah's mind on the stark reality of her situation. The AC's 2 ejection seat in the A-10 was a proven lifesaver, but ejecting over the desert carried its own significant risks. The terrain below was unforgiving with rocky outcroppings and deep washes that could seriously injure or kill a pilot, even if the ejection sequence worked perfectly. Additionally, search and rescue operations in the remote desert areas could take hours, and the daytime temperatures were already climbing toward dangerous levels. Sarah made the difficult decision to continue flying the aircraft as long as it remained controllable. The A-10 had been designed to absorb tremendous battle damage and still bring its pilot home, and she was determined to take advantage of that capability. However, she also began preparing mentally for the possibility that ejection might become necessary if the fire spread or if she lost complete control of the aircraft. The flight controls were becoming increasingly heavy as the hydraulic pressure continued to drop, and Sarah had to use both hands on the stick to maintain level flight. Her arms were already beginning to ache from the physical effort required to fly the aircraft, and she knew that fatigue would become a significant factor if she had to continue flying manually for an extended period. The A-10's control systems had been designed to be manageable without hydraulic assistance, but it required significant physical strength and endurance. Air traffic Control had cleared all other aircraft from the airspace around Sarah's emergency, and controllers at Davis Mountain were coordinating the response of crash and rescue vehicles. The base fire department was positioning there specialized aircraft rescue and firefighting trucks, while medical personnel prepared for the possibility of treating serious burn injuries. Flight surgeons were also standing by, knowing that smoke inhalation could cause serious medical complications, even if the pilot survived the landing. Lieutenant Torres and the second A-10 had taken up a position behind and slightly below Sarah's aircraft, where he could observe the situation and provide additional eyes on any changes in the aircraft's condition. His radio calls provided a steady stream of information to ground controllers about the progression of the emergency. Torres was also prepared to guide search and rescue forces to Sarah's location if she was forced to eject over the desert. "Sarah, you're trailing more smoke now, and I can see flames around the left engine," Torres reported, his voice tight with concern for his flight leader. "The fire appears to be growing. You need to seriously consider getting out of that aircraft." Tear flames Torres described represented the escalation Sarah had been dreading. Fire in an aircraft could spread rapidly, potentially destroying flight control cables, fuel lines, and other critical systems. Once fire took hold, aircraft could become uncontrollable within minutes, leaving pilots no choice but to eject regardless of the risks involved. Sarah knew that her window for safe ejection was narrowing with each passing moment. Despite the growing emergency, Sarah's training kept her focused on flying the aircraft. She maintained her heading toward Davis Mountain while working through the emergency checklists for both hydraulic failure and engine fire. The procedures were complex and required careful attention to detail, but they represented her best chance of getting the aircraft safely on the ground. Each checklist item was designed based on lessons learned from previous emergencies, often at the cost of aircraft and sometimes lives. The smoke in the cockpit had forced Sarah to switch to 100% oxygen, and she was beginning to feel the early effects of smoke inhalation despite her oxygen mask. Her throat was scratchy, and she could taste the metallic flavor of the emergency oxygen system. Medical studies had shown that even brief exposure to aircraft fire smoke could cause serious respiratory damage, and prolonged exposure could lead to incapacitation and death. As she struggled with the heavy flight controls, Sarah began to realize that her aircraft might not make it to Davis Mountain. The fire appeared to be spreading, and the smoke in the cockpit was getting worse despite her efforts to control it. The hydraulic system was now showing zero pressure, meaning she was flying entirely on the manual reversion system. Most critically, she wasn't sure she would have enough physical strength to control the aircraft for the 30 minutes it would take to reach her home base. The decision about where to attempt a landing was becoming urgent. The emergency landing strip at Barry M. Goldwater Range was only 10 minutes away, but it lacked the crash and rescue facilities that could save her life if the landing went badly. Davis Mountain had every possible emergency resource, but the aircraft might not survive the additional flight time required to reach it. Sarah knew that this decision could determine whether she lived or died, and she was running out of time to make the choice. The flames were now clearly visible from Morrison's F-16 licking along the left side of Sarah's A-10 like angry orange tongues. The hydraulic fluid that had been streaming from the aircraft was acting as additional fuel for the fire, creating a trail of flame that extended several feet behind the aircraft. Morrison had seen aircraft fires before, and he knew that Sarah's situation had moved beyond critical to potentially catastrophic. The structural integrity of the aircraft could fail at any moment if the fire reached primary support structures or fuel lines. Hog 11, Viper 111, you have significant fire on your left side now, Morrison transmitted urgently. The flames are spreading toward your wing root area. Strongly recommend immediate ejection. Sarah could feel the heat from the fire beginning to penetrate the cockpit, adding to the already unbearable smoke that was making it difficult to see her instruments clearly. Her oxygen mask was keeping her conscious, but she could sense that her judgment might be becoming impaired by the toxic fumes. The decision to eject had to be made while she still had the mental clarity to execute the ejection sequence properly and survive the landing that would follow. The terrain below was a mixture of desert floor and rocky hills, none of it particularly welcoming for a parachute landing. Search and rescue teams were already being vetoed toward her position, but in the vast expanse of the Arizona desert, finding a downed pilot could take precious hours, even with modern GPS technology. The summer heat was approaching dangerous levels, and survival in the desert without adequate water and shelter was measured in hours rather than days. Sarah made one final attempt to maintain control of the aircraft, pulling on the stick with both hands to keep the nose level. The manual reversion system was still responding, but the physical effort required was enormous, and her strength was fading rapidly. The smoke was getting thicker despite the oxygen flowing to her mask, and she was beginning to cough uncontrollably. Her vision was starting to blur, and she knew that she was rapidly approaching the point where she would lose the ability to safely eject. All stations, HOG 111. I'm losing control of the aircraft, Sarah transmitted, her voice strained from the physical effort and the effects of smoke inhalation. I'm going to have to punch out Vector. Search and rescue to my position immediately. The decision to eject was one that every military pilot hoped never to make, but all had trained for extensively. The ejection seat in the A-10 was a marvel of engineering, capable of safely extracting a pilot from an aircraft under the most extreme conditions. However, the ejection sequence itself was violent and dangerous, subjecting the pilot to forces that could cause serious injury even when everything worked perfectly. The seat would fire Sarah upward with explosive force, separating her from the burning aircraft, but exposing her to the risks of a parachute landing in hostile terrain. Sarah reached down and grasped the ejection seat handles, knowing that once she pulled them, there would be no turning back. The sequence of events that would follow was precisely timed and choreographed. The canopy would blow off. Explosive charges would fire her seat up and away from the aircraft, and her parachute would deploy automatically once she reached a safe altitude. If everything worked as designed, she would have a few minutes under the parachute to prepare for landing and assess the terrain below. Ejecting, ejecting, ejecting. Sarah called over the radio, pulling the ejection handle simultaneously with both hands. The explosive charges fired with tremendous force, launching Sarah and her seat upward through the open canopy and away from the burning A-10. The acceleration was tremendous, compressing her body into the seat and temporarily affecting her vision and consciousness. The seat's automatic systems deployed her parachute at the proper altitude, and suddenly the violent motion stopped as she found herself swaying gently beneath the white canopy below her. The A-10 continued its flight for several more seconds before the fire finally overcame the aircraft's structural integrity. Morrison watched in horror from his F-16 as the left wing separated from the fuselage, sending the aircraft into an uncontrolled tumble toward the desert floor. The crash, when it came, was spectacular and final, with a ball of flame and smoke marking the end of tail number 80248. Sarah had only a few minutes under the parachute to prepare for her landing, and she used the time to assess her physical condition and survey the terrain below. She appeared to have escaped serious injury from the ejection sequence, though her back ached from the violent acceleration forces. The desert floor was approaching rapidly, and she could see that she was heading for a relatively flat area between two rocky ridges. The landing would be hard, but she might avoid the worst of the boulder fields and cactus patches that could cause serious injury. The parachute landing was everything she had expected and worse. Despite her training in parachute landing techniques, the impact with the desert floor was jarring, and she felt something give way in her left ankle as she hit the ground and rolled. The parachute dragged her several yards across the rocky surface before she managed to activate the quick release mechanism and free herself from a harness. She lay still for a moment, taking inventory of her injuries and listening for the sound of rescue aircraft. Her left ankle was definitely injured, possibly fractured, and she had numerous cuts and scrapes from being dragged across the desert surface. More concerning was the persistent cough and burning sensation in her throat and lungs from the smoke she had inhaled during the emergency. However, she was alive and conscious, which was more than many pilots could say after ejecting from a burning aircraft. Morrison had watched Sarah's parachute descent and marked her landing position with his GPS, immediately relaying the coordinates to search and rescue forces. The sight of her parachute collapsing on the desert floor and her movement afterward had confirmed that she had survived the ejection and landing. But Morrison knew that survival in the desert heat was now her primary concern. He began a slow orbit around her position, maintaining visual contact while rescue helicopters were dispatched from Davis Month. Sarah activated her survival radio and personal locator beacon, devices that would guide rescue forces directly to her position. The radio crackled with the voices of pilots and controllers coordinating the rescue effort, confirming that help was on the way, but would take time to reach her remote location. She found what shade she could under a small mosquite bush and began the process of desert survival that all military pilots learned but hoped never to use. The temperature was climbing rapidly as the morning progressed toward midday, and Sarah knew that dehydration and heat exhaustion would become serious threats within hours. Her survival vest contained water, signaling devices, and first aid supplies, but the quantities were limited and designed to sustain life for only a short period. The rescue forces were racing against time, and the unforgiving environment of the Sonoran Desert to reach her before the heat became lethal. Captain Morrison continued his orbit high above Sarah's position. His F-16s, advanced sensors and communication systems serving as a vital link between the downed pilot and the rapidly assembling rescue forces. From his vantage point at $15,000 feet, he could see the pillar of black smoke rising from the crash site several miles away, where Sarah's A-10 had impacted the desert floor. The contrast between the burning wreckage and Sarah's small figure seeking shade below drove home the reality of how close she had come to death. The rescue operation was mobilizing with the precision and urgency that characterized military emergency response. At Davis Mountain Air Force Base, 2 HH-60 PAVE Hawk rescue helicopters were being prepared for immediate launch, their crews running through pre-flight checklists at maximum speed while maintaining the safety protocols that would ensure they could complete the rescue mission successfully. The helicopters were equipped with medical personnel, survival equipment, and the specialized gear needed for desert rescue operations. Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez, the lead pair of rescue men on the first helicopter, had participated in dozens of combat rescues during deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. Her experience in extracting injured personnel from hostile environments would be crucial in the challenging desert conditions. The medical team was preparing for the possibility of treating serious burns, smoke inhalation, and trauma injuries that commonly resulted from aircraft ejections and parachute landings. Sarah's survival training was being put to the ultimate test. As the Arizona sun climbed higher and the temperature soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, she had found the best available shade under a cluster of Palo Verde trees, but the protection from the sun was minimal. Her survival vest contained 2 pints of water, energy bars, and basic first aid supplies, but she knew these resources would have to last until rescue arrived. Desert survival experts had calculated that an uninjured person could survive perhaps 8 to 12 hours in these conditions, but Sarah's smoke inhalation and injured ankle reduced those odds significantly. The personal locator beacon in her survival vest was transmitting a strong signal that rescue forces could track with precision, but the mountainous terrain and distance from the base meant that the helicopters would need at least 20 minutes to reach her location. 20 Minutes might not sound like long, but in the desert heat with injuries and smoke damage to her lungs, every minute counted toward her survival. Morrison's radio crackled with updates from the Rescue Coordination Center as the operation developed. Viper 111 Pedro 111 is airborne and proceeding to the survivor's location. Estimated time of arrival 20 minutes. How is the survivor's condition? Morrison adjusted his orbit to get a better view of Sarah's position. Through his aircraft's targeting pod, he could see her moving occasionally, which indicated she was conscious and responsive, but he could also see that she was conserving her energy by remaining as still as possible in the limited shade. Pedro 111 survivor appears conscious and mobile, but is conserving energy. She has found minimal shade and appears to be following proper survival procedures. Recommend maximum speed to her location. The first rescue helicopter call sign. Pedro 111 was flying at maximum speed across the desert landscape. Its crew scanning the terrain ahead for the best approach to Sarah's position. The pilot, Major Lisa Chun, had extensive experience in difficult rescue operations and understood that the success of the mission would depend not just on reaching Sarah quickly, but on extracting her safely without causing additional injuries. The terrain around Sarah's position was rough and rocky, which would make finding a suitable landing zone challenging. Sarah could hear the sound of Morrison's F-16 circling overhead, reassuring reminder that she hadn't been forgotten and that help was on the way. The sound of jet engines in the distance also served as an audio beacon that rescue helicopters could use to home in on her location. She used her survival mirror to flash signals toward Morrison's aircraft, both to confirm her condition and to practice the signaling techniques she might need when the helicopters arrived. The effects of smoke inhalation were becoming more apparent as time passed. Sarah's breathing was labored, and she was coughing up dark material that indicated significant smoke damage to her respiratory system. Her throat felt raw and swollen, and she was having difficulty swallowing the small sips of water she allowed herself from her limited supply. Medical personnel at Davis Mountain had advised the rescue crews to be prepared for serious respiratory injuries that might require immediate treatment. Lieutenant Torres, flying the second A-10, had climbed to a higher altitude where he could coordinate with air traffic control and provide additional communication support for the rescue operation. From his position, he could monitor multiple radio frequencies and relay information between the various agencies involved in Sarah's rescue. His aircraft also served as a backup communication link in case Morrison's F-16 developed any problems. The rescue helicopters were now within 5 minutes of Sarah's position, and their crews were beginning to assess the challenges they would face in extracting her from the rough terrain. The pilot of Pedro 111 had identified a possible landing zone about 200 yards from Sarah's position, but it would require precision flying to set the helicopter down safely in the confined space between rocky outcroppings and desert vegetation. Sarah could now hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the north, a sound that represented salvation from the deadly desert environment. She prepared her signaling mirror and smoke flares, ready to guide the rescue aircraft to her exact location. The sound of the approaching helicopters also gave her a psychological boost, replacing the despair and fear that had been building with hope for survival. Master Sergeant Vasquez was already preparing her equipment for a rapid deployment to Sarah's position. The pararescue man's training had taught her to expect the unexpected in rescue operations, and she was mentally preparing for the possibility that Sarah's injuries might be more serious than initially reported. The heat, smoke inhalation, and stress of the emergency could all combine to create life-threatening medical complications that would require immediate treatment. As the first helicopter approached Sarah's position, Morrison and his F-16 began a coordinated handoff of responsibility from air-to-air coordination to ground-based rescue operations. His role as the eyes and ears of the rescue mission was nearly complete, but he would continue orbiting until Sarah was safely aboard the helicopter and en route to medical treatment. The sight of the rescue helicopter approaching Sarah's position was a reminder of the incredible coordination and professionalism that made such rescues possible in even the most challenging environments. The rescue was entering its most critical phase, where split-second decisions and flawless execution would determine whether Sarah survived her ordeal in the Arizona desert. The H-60 Pave Hawk helicopter approached Sarah's position, with Major Chin demonstrating the precise flying skills that had made her one of the most respected rescue pilots in the Air Force. The desert landing zone was even more challenging than it had appeared from altitude, with loose rocks, hidden gullies, and towering saguaro cacti, creating obstacles that could damage the helicopter's rotors or landing gear. Chun had to use every bit of her experience to find a safe approach path while maintaining the speed necessary to minimize Sarah's exposure to the deadly heat. Master Sergeant Vasquez was already positioned at the helicopter's door, her medical equipment and rescue gear secured, but ready for immediate deployment. She could see Sarah's small figure waving weakly from beneath the sparse shade of the desert vegetation, and her experienced eye immediately assessed the pilot's condition. Sarah appeared conscious and alert, but her movements were slow and deliberate, indicating possible heat exhaustion and the effects of her injuries. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris, its rotor wash creating a temporary sandstorm that obscured visibility around the landing zone. Chin kept the engines running and the rotors turning, ready for immediate takeoff once Sarah was aboard. Desert rescues were always races against time, and every second on the ground increased the risk to both the survivor and the rescue crew. Vasquez sprinted across the rocky terrain towards Sarah's position, her heavy medical pack bouncing on her back. As she navigated the uneven ground, years of training and combat experience had taught her to move quickly but safely in challenging terrain, avoiding the ankle-breaking rocks and hidden crevices that could end a rescue mission. Before it began, behind her, a second pararescue man followed with additional medical equipment and a portable stretcher. Sarah tried to stand as the rescue team approached, but her injured ankle gave way and she collapsed back to the ground. The combination of heat, dehydration, smoke inhalation, and her parachute landing injuries had taken a severe toll on her body. Vasquez immediately began her medical assessment, checking Sarah's pulse, breathing, and level of consciousness while looking for signs of serious trauma that might require immediate treatment. "Captain, I'm Master Sergeant Vasquez, and we're here to get you out," she said, her voice calm and reassuring despite the urgency of the situation. "Can you tell me where you're hurt?" Sarah's voice was hoarse and strained from the smoke inhalation. "Left ankle possibly broken. Smoke inhalation is bad. Having trouble breathing." Her words came in short, labored phrases that confirmed Vasquez's assessment that respiratory distress was the most immediate concern. Vasquez quickly applied a pulse oximeter to Sarah's finger, measuring the oxygen saturation in her blood. The reading was dangerously low, confirming that the smoke inhalation had caused significant damage to her lungs. She immediately placed Sarah on supplemental oxygen while her partner began immobilizing the injured ankle. The medical team worked with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated by countless hours of training and real-world experience. Meanwhile, Morrison continued his orbit overhead, coordinating with air traffic control to ensure that the airspace around the rescue site remained clear of other aircraft. From his vantage point, he could see the rescue helicopter on the ground and the small figures of the rescue team working around Sarah's position. The sight filled him with relief, knowing that his fellow pilot was finally getting the medical attention she desperately needed. The rescue team quickly determined that Sarah's condition required immediate evacuation to a trauma center rather than the flight surgeon at Davis Mountain. Her smoke inhalation injuries were serious enough to require specialized treatment that was only available at the civilian trauma center in Tucson. Vasquez radioed this information to the helicopter crew while her partner finished securing Sarah to the stretcher. The trip back to the helicopter was treacherous, with the rescue team navigating the rocky terrain while carrying Sarah on the stretcher. The desert surface was littered with loose stones that could cause a fall, potentially injuring the rescuers or further traumatizing the patient. Vasquez maintained constant communication with Sarah during the movement, monitoring her condition and providing reassurance that help was at hand. As the helicopter lifted off with Sarah aboard, Morrison finally felt the tension of the last hour begin to ease. The rescue had been successful, but he knew that Sarah still faced a long recovery from her injuries. Smoke inhalation could cause serious long-term respiratory problems, and her ankle injury might require multiple surgeries to heal properly. However, she was alive and receiving medical care, which was the best possible outcome given the severity of the emergency. The flight to the trauma center took only 15 minutes, but for Sarah it felt like hours. The oxygen mask helped her breathing, but she was still coughing up dark material and struggling with each breath. Vasquez continued monitoring her vital signs, while coordinating with the trauma team at the hospital, providing detailed information about Sarah's injuries and the circumstances of the accident. At University Medical Center in Tucson, a full trauma team was waiting for Sarah's arrival. The emergency department had been alerted about the incoming patient and had prepared one of their specialized trauma bays for treatment of smoke inhalation and potential burn injuries. The hospital's burn unit was one of the best in the Southwest, equipped with hyperbaric oxygen chambers and other advanced treatments for respiratory injuries. As the helicopter approached the hospital's landing pad, Sarah lost consciousness from a combination of smoke inhalation and exhaustion. Vasquez immediately increased the oxygen flow and began preparing for the possibility that Sarah might need intubation and mechanical ventilation. The medical team's quick thinking and professional response had gotten Sarah this far, but her survival now depended on the specialized care available at the trauma center. Morrison was finally cleared to return to Davis-Monthan, his role in the rescue operation complete. As he flew back to base, he couldn't help but think about the tail number of Sarah's aircraft 80248. The numbers would be forever etched in his memory, representing not just the loss of a valuable aircraft, but the incredible courage and skill of a fellow pilot who had fought to save her aircraft and then survived against overwhelming odds in the unforgiving desert. The tail number had become a symbol of both loss and survival, a reminder of the risks that military aviators faced every time they took to the skies in service of their country. The investigation into the cause of Sarah's aircraft emergency would take months to complete, but the heroic rescue and Sarah's eventual recovery would become part of Air Force legend, inspiring future generations of pilots and rescue personnel who might one day face similar challenges in the line of duty.